Yesterday we gave you the analogy of if a website was a person, then the HTML becomes the skeleton, right? It's like the raw base components, kind of like the bones that hold up the basic web page together. In that analogy, we said then CSS would be more akin to the skin, aka it's the thing that makes it pretty, it makes it usable, makes it very readable for human readers. Um, and really, all CSS is that it does kind of two simple things in a very concise manner. It because it all it does is it kind of dresses or at least it modifies the existing elements to make them more visually appealing. The only thing we're worried about in CSS is writing rules. And what are rules? Rules are just instructions for the computer to say, I want to do this to these elements. That's pretty much it, right? And so the only thing in CSS that we're concerned about is what elements we want to do it to. Sorry, what we want to do to the elements and which elements we want to do it to. Okay, and so when we talk about CSS, a lot of times when we talk about these changes, because they are more stylistic changes, we say how we want to style the CSS, and then obviously which elements we want to style. And so the piece of code up here right now may not mean much to you, but in CSS, what it's saying is take all of the list items and then change the font color to blue. And that's what's, oh, I guess kind of gave it away, but that's exactly what we're going to do, right? Like this is all CSS is doing. This all it's saying is, hey, I want to do this thing to these elements. And so today we're going to talk about writing the syntax for writing CSS rules. We'll talk about ways to choose which elements to change, which is almost an art form in of itself. We'll talk about different properties that we can change. And ultimately, the goal here is to get from yesterday, which is HTML and kind of a pure content play, and then merge that with CSS so that it's now more about style as well. And hopefully the end result is then we get this kind of actual web page layout. Okay, sound good? All right, let's get started. So the page on the left is from Stack Overflow. It's a site that if you haven't used now, you will definitely use it once you start programming full time. Essentially, it's like the Wikipedia for programmers. Oh, sorry, that's not Stack Overflow. I'm sorry, that's the MDN homepage, which is another reference site for programming concepts. In any case, we can agree that the page on the left is pretty user friendly, right? We can see where the header is, we can see where all the links link to, and especially that gray box in the middle there. That's very useful because that's actually, if you squint and look closely, you actually see that that's sample code. And because of the way the page is visually laid out, I can very quickly identify, oh, here's the explanation of what this concept is or what this thing is. In the gray area, I have some sample code that I can right away take a look at and see how it looks kind of in the wild. And then I see where all the other links and all the other things are laid out as well. In short, it's very user friendly. It's very easy for someone to take a look at and know what's going on. On the right hand side, we literally have the same exact site, as in every word, every piece of content on the left hand side also exists on the right hand side. The only difference is there's no CSS, there's no styling. And so what we get is a site that looks like something that came out of 1980 probably, right? It's just plain text, it's just raw information without any type of visual stimulation to kind of help us understand where we're supposed to look at, how the data is laid out, and ultimately, make something that's actually very usable. And I think, nowadays, especially as the internet becomes kind of, it becomes less of this fancy tool and more of a utility in a lot of ways, like electricity or gas in some ways. People, expect high quality websites, right? They will not accept what we see on the right hand side. Instead, they'll say, I want a well designed website with a good user experience. And so, whereas traditionally people might think of CSS as, oh, it's just something that we use to pretty up a website. It actually is more than that, right? It's becoming like a very crucial aspect of actually presenting the information to people in a way that they'll actually be able to use and accept. So here is a sample CSS rule, and this is pretty complicated. So I don't want you to focus as much on the text, but I will walk you through each one of these pieces and what they mean individually. So the first thing is this is a rule. A rule, once again, is made of two parts, right? The first part is what we want to do, and the second part is who we want to do it to, right? So what style changes do we want to make, and then which elements do we want to make those style changes to, right? If you think about it, it kind of makes sense. We don't want to make the same change to every element on the page, right? If I have a header, I want to make the text bold, well, I only want to bold the header. I don't want to bold everything else on the page because then it's not my intended effect. And so a rule is just something that combines those two aspects: what we want to change and what we want to apply the changes to. Then in the middle, then this gray line here, and we'll come back to this in more detail. This is a declaration. All it means is this is a simple rule. Okay, all the declarations, so all the changes we want to make in CSS, all the rules are going to be placed inside these curly braces that we see on the very first line and the very last line. Okay, everything that comes before the curly brace is going to be who we want to do it to. Everything that goes in between the curly braces is going to be what we want to do, right? What changes we actually want to make. And so when we say a declaration, that effectively is a change that we want to make, and we'll break that down in more detail in 1 second. So if that's the changes we want to make, then this first part, right, all of this things that comes before this curly brace, this is what we call the selector. This tells us which elements we want to apply these changes to. We're going to talk about this in a lot more depth, but just know that everything outside of the curly brace has to do with which elements we want to select, and everything inside the curly braces are going to be the actual changes we want to make. So when we look at each declaration, and before I forget, just notice how each declaration is separated by a semicolon, right? That's how we separate one declaration from another. So here in this set of curly braces, we actually have two declarations or two changes we want to make. The first one is border, colon, 1px, solid red, semicolon, and that ends that declaration. The second declaration is font style, colon, italic, semicolon, and that ends that declaration. So whereas a semicolon ends a declaration, a colon then is something that separates the two parts of a declaration. And the two parts of a declaration are, one is the property. So what part of the element are we looking to change? And then the other one is called the value. What change are we actually trying to make, right? And so if I just kind of explain this to you verbally, hopefully it makes a lot of sense. So we've selected a bunch of elements, and in this declaration, what I'm saying is, I want you to take the border of this element, and I want to, that's a property, and the value that I want you to change it to is 1 pixel solid red. And effectively, in layman terms, all that really means is just, hey, I want you to take this border, or I want to take this element, and I want to add a solid red 1 pixel wide border around it. That's it. If I look at the next declaration, which is font-style, colon, italic, well, font style becomes the property. So that's what we're trying to change, which is the font style. And the value that we're going to change it to is the value, so italic. So this basically means, hey, take this element, take the text inside of it, and let's italicize the text. Every HTML element is going to have its own set of properties or things you're able to tweak. And it makes sense that they be different from element to element. For example, yesterday we saw an image tag, right? So if I think about a traditional paragraph tag, for example, that holds text, I can say, oh great, let's change the size and the font of that text. But if I have an image tag, well, there's no font for me to change either the size or the style of, and so that becomes not really relevant, right? But in fact, there are other properties of the image tag that we can change that wouldn't make sense to change for text. And so because of that, every element is going to have its own set of properties that you can change. And in the workshop and the reading today, we'll go through those properties in more depth. The reason why we don't go into it into the slides is because it basically becomes me rattling off about 20 properties in a row, you not really remembering any of them, and then having to look them up again later as well. So we figured it would be easier for us to at least just kind of talk you through what properties are, what values are, how we use them, and then in the workshop you'll get a lot more hands-on practice on actually tweaking and applying these different rules and properties, or these properties and values. And so just to kind of recap all of this then, this for a rule, all this rule is saying is, hey, let's apply these styles, right, these declarations, so once again the border and the font style, to these elements, or rather elements that match this selector. And we'll talk in more depth about what selector means and how we select in a little bit. And all of these things together basically makes kind of one big rule for us to follow. And that's all CSS is a bunch of changes that we're making to a bunch of elements that we specify. Any questions so far? Okay, cool. So let's take a look at this very hairy tag up here at the very top, right? You'll notice that this is an A tag, so this is a link tag that we talked about yesterday. And if you notice inside of it, in the A tag, it's not just an A tag, right? I've also put a bunch of attributes inside there too. Remember attributes yesterday we learned about were things like IDs and classes? And indeed, this tag has both an ID of full stack as well as a class of David. And so the question becomes then, how do I, if I want to do something to this tag, if I want to change this tag, if I want to change the font size or the color or what have you, how do I actually how do I actually write the CSS so that I can tell the HTML, hey, grab this tag? Well, there's a bunch of ways for us to do it, and we're only going to be talking about three of them today, which are tag, class, and ID. Attribute, pseudo element, and pseudo class are all perfectly valid ways to do this too, but we're not going to talk about them within the scope of this particular curriculum. Okay. So if I want to grab this tag, how do I create in CSS? How do I actually select this tag? Well, the actual answer is actually pretty easy. We literally just write whatever the tag is called, right? So here, if I'm trying to select an A tag, well, in my CSS selector, so the part that comes before the curly brace, and Helmut, I see you taking a photo. I promise you, I'll work to get these slides uploaded as soon as I get permission from the folks upstairs. In any case, you guys will have access to all this material for sure. It's just a matter of timing. So we're really sorry we don't have it. We couldn't get to you earlier. Sorry. So if I want to select the A tag in CSS, all I really have to do is just select A. Right? If I just write A, then my default CSS knows that, oh, I am looking for A tag. And not just a single one, I'm looking for all A tags. The other way for me to select this tag would be say, well, give me all the tags that have the class of David, which this tag that I'm showing you also fits in, right? And the way that we tell CSS we're looking for all the elements with a certain class value is with that dot, that period in the front, right? So notice how under class we're searching for dot David. Dot David means give me all the elements with a class value of David. And then last but not least, if I want to search for an element based on the ID value, I search hashtag or # full stack. And what that # or the hashtag does is, look, give me all the elements that have an ID value of full stack. Remember from yesterday, we mentioned that really in all cases, on any given page, there should only be one element with a single ID value, right? As in, you should not have multiple elements with the same ID value. And so generally speaking, when we look at a CSS selector that's trying to find an ID value, that's looking up an element by an ID value, then there only should be one element that matches that criteria or that selection criteria. And so, and I know I'm going through this a bit fast, but I promise you when we look at the real code, this will hopefully make a lot more sense. Now we're just trying to make sure you understand the kind of high-arching concepts of what powers these CSS rules. So in the previous slide, we talked about how I can identify a tag based on the tag value. I can identify it based on the class value if I give it one. And I can also identify it based on the ID value if I give it one as well. Well, as you can probably imagine, there's actually ways that we can kind of combine those selection criteria together so we can be even more precise when we search, right? So it's like saying like, oh, give me all the people with dark hair in the class and then give me all the people with, who wear glasses. Well, I can combine those and say, give me all the people with dark hair and glasses, and now I'm being a lot more selective in picking out the elements I actually want to pick out. And so a few ways for us to combine these different selectors. The first one is just to literally do tag.class. And all that does is now the criteria says, hey, give me an element that have both that tag value as well as that class value. Okay, and so here I would do a.david as a way to say, hey, give me all the elements that have give me all the a tag elements that also have a class value of David. If I do tag space.class, and this is a very slight nuance, what this means is give me all the elements with the second value, which is a .class value, but only if it's parent or parent's parents, or all the way going up if one of his ancestors, remember the parent-child relationship we talked about yesterday? Give me an element with a .class value if an ancestor also has, in this case, that particular tag value. I know this seems very complicated and very hairy, so don't concern yourself too much if you can't visually imagine how that looks. We just want you to be aware that there are very granular and very complex ways for us to select and search through these different criteria. The next one up is tag comma that class. And as you can imagine, all that is saying, give me an element with either the tag value or the class value or both. And then lastly, tag and then this greater than sign and then dot class means give me an element with that class value whose parent is that given tag value. By the look on your faces, I know a lot of this seems very overwhelming. So as a recap to all of this, just know that when we say, in CSS, when we say, I want to pick out these elements, you have a lot of tools at your disposal to be able to pick out as precisely the elements that you want as precisely as possible, right? And it's usually done through a combination of saying, give me this combination of tag, classes, and IDs. Does this at a high level make sense to folks? Yes, no, kind of. I guess we'll find out in a little bit. And so this, just so we're kind of on the same page here, this bit here that I've talked for the past couple minutes, this is all just in the CSS part. This is the, oh, how do we pick the elements we want to do this to? These are things that lets you pick the elements you want to change. And then last but not least, as with HTML, as a side note, how do we do comments? Comments in CSS are just characterized by the backslash asterisk, and then you end the comment with an asterisk backslash. Just like how in HTML, comments can go anywhere. They can be as many lines as you want it to be, and effectively what they do is they're ways for you to leave messages to other human programmers. The computer neither reads it nor runs the comments. Okay, so now we're going to move on to this idea of cascading style sheets, which, by the way, if you look at the initials, it stands for CSS, which is what CSS actually stands for. We've talked a little bit about the style sheet part of it, right? About making changes to elements and then figuring out which elements we want to make the changes to. Now we're going to talk a little bit about the cascading part. And so what does cascading mean? Usually when we say cascading, we think of waterfall, right? As in the highest waterfall, kind of the water goes from the highest level to the second highest level to the third highest level, and so on and so forth, all the way until it reaches the very ground level. In context of HTML elements, what this usually means is that for any given element, and indeed if we go back to CN's website, you'll see that it's true almost across all the websites that you or I probably visit. Across, on any given website, almost every element will have multiple rules being applied to it. Okay, so it's not just saying like, oh, for this element, I want these 5 rules and that's it. What usually will happen is you have one rule that says, hey, can you make all the font size 12? And maybe this particular element falls into that category. You might have another rule that says, hey, can you make all the background colors red? And this element might also fall under that category. And then you might have another rule that says, can you make all of the text bold? And then this element might fall under that category as well. And so whenever we visually see the element, it's not saying, oh, there's only one set of rules applied to it. We're actually seeing as a result of multiple rules being applied to the same element. And in general, if those rules do not conflict, then we will see all of those rules manifest or show up in the element. So all that means, all that is a very long way of saying is an element's style is a merge of all of the rules that apply to that element. So let's take a look at more of a real world example. On the left hand side, we have this index.html document. You'll notice we have our head tag as well as our body tag. In the head tag, don't worry too much about this for now. All this is saying is, hey, I'm going to have 2 other separate CSS documents, and I'm going to link them to this HTML document, okay? And those 2 documents, you'll see them on your right-hand side. They're the styles.a.css and then styles.b.css. In the body of the HTML, we have an unordered list, and in that we have a list item, a single list item with a text A. And so if we notice, there are basically 3 things that are changing this list item, okay? The first one is in the HTML itself, you'll actually see this style attribute, right? And what the style attribute is saying is background color, background dash color, colon blue. That's pretty much just CSS. That's a CSS declaration, right? It's saying change the background color of this element to blue. So that's one way in which we're changing this list element. In styles a.css, notice how in the selector it's just li. That's just literally saying, hey, select all the list elements on this page. Of course, we only have one list element, so we know for sure we're going to select it. And then in the declaration, it says color, colon, red, semicolon. And so that's just one rule that basically says, take the font color, and let's change it to red. And then in the styles b.css, once again, our selector only selects one list element, and it says change the font size to 40 pixels. Right? So we basically have three different documents or three areas that are trying to make change to the same element. And so when we look at the style for this element, we will see that because one's changing background color, one's changing text color, and one is changing font size, well, these are all different parts of the element, and they don't really conflict, so we can actually show all three changes in one element. And when we do, we get an element, we get an element that looks something like this, right? It's a list element, so that's why I have that bullet in the front. In the HTML itself, I changed the background color to blue. And by the way, whenever we try to add a style specification in the HTML itself, we call it inline styling. So we're styling it in the line of the HTML itself. So that's where the background blue color comes from. If we look at styles a.css, that changes the font color to red, which is why the A and the bullet are in red. And then lastly, in the styles b.css, notice how the font size is 40, and I guess we can take it for granted that that's a size 40 font, right? And so here we have a single element, we have three different rules trying to change it, and because those rules don't conflict, we now see that all the rules are reflected in this element. Effectively, this is all CSS is, right? Is that I have in this case, I have my list element, and all I'm doing is changing different parts of it for visual or for styling purposes. Any questions here? Yeah, go ahead. Yeah, so we're actually so for the next like 5 slides, we're going to talk about conflict resolving and priority levels. But the short answer is inline styling does take precedence over external CSS documents. Yes, that's true, but I will say that in real world and practice, inline styling is not the best way. Usually, you want to keep all your changes in one place. So, what I've been taught is that inline styling is more of like a panic button. It's not something you should be relying on consistently. Yeah. Yeah. Cool. So, are there any other questions before we move on to the conflict resolution? Okay, so let's move on. So now the big question becomes, well, so I've said that if the rules don't conflict, all the changes get reflected, everyone's happy. Great. What happens when the rules do conflict? And the answer is the way that the way that CSS is applied to documents, there is a very clear precedence level, right? Remember yesterday I said computers do very well with precise logical decision making. They do very poorly with ambiguity, right? And so even when there's a conflict, the CSS and HTML, they have a very, very specified rule of the order in which they're going to resolve these conflicts. And generally speaking, the rule of thumbs for resolving conflicts, so we have multiple declarations trying to change the element in the same way. So if you have one rule saying let's change the font color to red, and another rule saying let's change the font color to blue, usually usually the rule the rule that is more specific takes the higher precedence. And what do I do when I mean, or sorry, what I mean when I say more specific? What I mean is the selector is more selective or more specific. So let's take a look at the example here. Here I have on the very top there, you see a div with the ID of thing, right? And I have two rules. On the left-hand side, I have a rule that changes, that selects all div tags, right? We see that div before the curly brace. And in the declaration, I'm changing the background to red. On the right-hand side, I have the same declaration. I'm changing the background to blue instead of red, but my selection is hashtag thing. So I'm looking it up by the ID, right? And so the left-hand side rule is trying to change the element because the tag is a div tag. The right-hand rule is trying to change the element because the ID is thing. And so if we go back to our idea of if we go back to this assertion we have that the more specific rule wins out, as in the one that's the most specific criteria for selecting wins out, then we can say that the ID is definitely more selective, right, than the tag, because I could have I could have multiple div tags on a page, but I will only have a tag with a single ID on a page. And so once again, not once again, but because this selection criteria is more specific, then this rule wins. And usually the order in which we think about the order of specificity is ID is the most specific, followed by class, and then followed by tag. So as you can imagine, tag is the most general, and ID is the most specific. And so if I now do an example with class, here I have a div with a background of red again. On the right-hand side, now rather than selecting by ID, I'm selecting by class.foo. I'm trying to change the background to green. Well, the row with the more specific criteria wins, which in this case is the class value of .foo, and so therefore the background changes to green. Everyone good so far? The more specific rule will win. So then, what if I have this thing here, right? On the left-hand side, I'm changing the ID. I'm selecting the element based on the ID of thing. On the right-hand side, notice how in the class value there, I actually have a space between those two values. When you do that, what you're saying is actually that you want multiple classes applied to the same element. So here, the element actually has two class values. One's called foo and one's called bar. And when I select that, if you notice on the right-hand side, I can do .foo.bar. And if you remember our combinator syntax from earlier, what that means is I want all elements with both a foo class and also a bar class, which my div element fits into, right? And I'm trying to just change the background element to green. And so now the question becomes, which rule is more specific? And the answer is the thing, or the ID rule, is still more specific, right? ID will always trump class, if you will, and then class will always trump tabs. Trump tags. Doesn't matter if you have 20 classes on here. ID is still usually seen as the most specific. And then last but not least, here I have a nested div, right? I have a div inside of a div. On the left-hand side, I have a ID of thing. I change the font size to 30. On the right-hand side, notice how I have a space between the outer and the foo. That just means give me an element with a class value of foo, whose parent or whose ancestor has the class value of outer. I'm trying to change the background to green. So which tag's going to win out? And it's a bit of a trick question because the answer is what's going to win out is actually the inline style. And so I guess to answer Dennis's question more clearly now, the hierarchy that we should be thinking about is inline style is the highest priority, and because the inline style is actually built into the HTML itself, and then after inline style, then do we move on to the external CSS documents, and in CSS it's ID first, then class, then tag. One other thing to note here, right, is the inline style is trying to change the background to orange, and the right-hand side rule is trying to change the background to green. And those are going to clash, and the inline style is going to win out, and the background is going to be orange. But if you look at the left-hand rule on the ID side, well, there, I'm just trying to change the font size to 30. And so it doesn't matter what the inline style says, my font size is still going to be relevant. And so because of that, in this case, the left-hand side rule will also apply as well. Okay, so once again, the priority level, just so we're clear, inline style, then ID, then class, then tags. And last but not least, this is a cartoon that you'll see in a lot of different places when people try to figure out or explain CSS. It's the famous Family Guy skit, where if you try to use one of these blinds, like every time you change one small thing, it has a tremendous amount of usually negative, unforeseen consequences. And the reason why is because, when we think about this one element at a time, of saying, hey, let's change this one element, it's like pretty straightforward. But on the CN homepage, as you just saw, there's literally thousands of elements, right? And you probably have hundreds of rules on that page. And so you can imagine the matrix of trying to say, hey, let's change these 1,000 things, these hundreds of different ways, and let's make sure that every element looks exactly the way that we want it to. It gets very hairy very, very quickly. And so CSS is something that, as long as the concepts make sense, that's great, but you definitely need a lot of practice, and it's something that a lot of programmers dread because of how potentially confusing, things like arranging visuals and spacing could be. So that's all the material we have in terms of kind of going over the slides. In your workshops today, you'll have a lot more in-depth material about these concepts, as well as a list of some of the common properties that you'll be dealing with, like font size, background color, etc. But before we move on to there, are there any questions on anything that I've talked about so far?